Tov Gedvach, we are up to Ayin Aleph, Amud Aleph. We're going to go back a little bit because the last Gemara was a little bit confusing. I want to make sure that we all understand it. And so we're going to go all the way back to Mils de Pshitil Hu Labai Varava. So it's about halfway through the Amud. If you're on the article, it's 71a2. And here we go. So just to remind us, what happened last time we learned. We spoke about these two scenarios where a person does the same act. In one case, the person knows it's Shabbos, but forgets that the particular melacha, the particular work that they're doing on Shabbos is forbidden. So they know it's Shabbos, but they don't know this particular melacha is forbidden. And then you have another case where they don't know it's Shabbos, but they do know that the malacha is forbidden. Both of those are cases which are called shogeg. They're classified as mistakes. The mistake in one case is a lack of knowledge of the work being forbidden, the activity being prohibited, and the other case is the lack of knowledge or the lack of awareness that it's Shabbos on this day. And what came out from the earlier Gemara is that despite those being two different types of mistakes, in certain cases they're going to be mitztarif, which means they're going to connect to one another. They're going to be the sin, the carbon, this offering that's going to be brought for one of those scenarios is going to cover the other scenarios. So despite them being different types of scenarios, they're going to connect when it comes to a carbon, okay? And this is something that both Abaye and Rava were clear about, but as the Gemara is going to point out, not everyone agreed or not everyone was clear on this idea. Says the Gemara, Mils de Pshita, and we're learning Le'ila Nishmas Mindel Mariam Bas Kalman Ruvain, her Neshama Shem Aliyah. Mils de Pshita Le'hu La'Abaye and Rava. Something that was obvious to both Abaye and Rava, Mibayil Rav Zera, was something which was not so clear to Rav Zera. How do we know that? By Rav Zera, Rav Asi. Rav Zera asked the following question from Rav Asi, V'amri la b'mine Rav Yirmiyah, Rav Zera. Some say that it was Rav Yirmiyah who asked of Rav Zera. What was the question? Katzar v'tachan chatzi grogos. So a person reaped and ground half the size of produce. In other words, whenever you do any malacha, there is a measurement that makes you chayav a chatas. So in other words, let's say you bake. If you bake a cake that's this big, you will not be obligated. If you carry something that's this tiny, you're not going to be obligated. There's measurements, okay? So in this case, a person went ahead and they reaped or ground, they did one or the other, of a half a measurement. B'shigga Shabbos uzdo malachas. First they did it knowing that the malacha, this action of grinding or reaping, is forbidden, but they forgot that it was Shabbos. V'chazar, then they go again without becoming aware of the earlier transgression. B'katz v'dachan chatzi grogos v'zdon Shabbos v'shiggas malachos. And then they go ahead and this time they flip it. They know that it's Shabbos, but they don't realize that what they're doing is forbidden. Okay, so in one case they did half, in the other case they did the other half. In one case they knew it was Shabbos, didn't know the malacha was forbidden. The other case they did not know it was Shabbos, but they did know the malacha was forbidden. So Maushi Starfu, what is the law? Do they combine or do they not combine? Amrle, the response given was chalukin lechatos, that since deliberate about Shabbos and mistaken about malacha, and deliberate about malacha and mistaken about Shabbos do not combine, okay? Therefore, they're separate for the chatas. In other words, they're separate regarding a chatas offering. A chatas offering for one will not cover the other. Therefore, v'lo mitzdarfin, therefore they do not combine to two half measurements to create a whole. So what we see very clearly is that Rav Zera over here disagrees with Abaye and Rava. Abaye and Rava said that even though the type of mistake is different, they do connect to one another for a carbon chatas, but Rav Zera is telling us that they do not connect together for a carbon chatas. Now, the Gemara is now going to analyze further the svara, the logic that he presented. He said that since they are separate regarding the chatas offering, that one chatas offering in one of those scenarios is not going to cover the other, because of that they don't combine. And the Gemara is going to question this premise that when things are separate regarding the chatas offering, they don't combine. Okay, let's see what the question is. Let's start with the Gemara asks, whenever things are separate regarding the chatas offering, meaning a chatas is not going to cover both scenarios, therefore they don't combine, we'll see that's not the case. If that's not, we learned in the Mishnah, a person goes ahead and eats chelev, forbidden fats, in one lapse of awareness, okay? You're only chai for one carbon chata. So again, there's certain fats which are forbidden, and let's say I wake up one morning and I eat chelev, and unknowingly, I didn't realize it's chelev. And then a few hours later, I eat another piece of chelev. Even though I had two full portions of chelev, of this forbidden fat, I only bring one carbon. However, if I go ahead and eat a measurement of a number of different prohibitions, so I go ahead and I eat forbidden fats, and then I have a portion of blood, and then I have which is also forbidden, and then I have a portion of karbanos which are invalidated for different reasons, called noser and pigul, and I do that all in one lapse. I have to bring carbon for each one of those sins that I committed. Okay, in this respect, many types meaning many types, meaning blood, fats, the carbonos that are invalid, they are more stringent than something of the same type, i.e. chelev, where I had two pieces of chelev within one lapse. Okay, so it's more stringent. And the following, we're about to say, there's going to be one stringency where one type, min echad, is more stringent than many types. Meaning, what's the case? If a person goes ahead and eats a half a portion of one type, and then another half portion of another type, then those combine to bring one carbon. Mishnei minim pater. But if you have a half portion of two different types of prohibitions, then you are exempt. Now the Gemara asks, it was asked about this Mishnah, what novelty is there in telling me that if a person eats two half pieces from the same type of prohibition, they combine? Of course, two halves make a whole. Like, that is the most obvious thing. So the Gemara answers, Reish Lakish answered the name of Bar Tutni. And what are we talking about? That's a scenario where the person ate the same prohibition, but two types of dishes, meaning they had chelev, which was baked for breakfast, and then chelev, which was fried for lunch. And the novelty is the following. Rabbi Yeshua, it's the view of Rabbi Yeshua, who says in another place that different types of dishes have two different types of karbanos. Meaning, we said earlier, if a person eats chelev, forbidden fats, within one lapse of awareness, they eat one portion, and then a few hours later they eat another portion, or whatever, 10 minutes later they eat another portion, you are only going to be chayav one. Rabbi Yeshua comes along and says, but if one of them was baked and one of them was fried, you have to actually bring two. So the Gemara is telling us now, Maudatem, I would have thought Rabbi Yeshua ben lekula ben lechumra. Rabbi Yeshua says his ruling both as a leniency and a stringency. Kamash b'lan lekula lo amar, lechumra amar, he only says it as a stringency. What does that mean? What that means is our case, what we just said, when it's the same min, when it's the same type, it combines, is Rabbi Yeshua. And there's a novelty. What's the novelty? The novelty is that even though Rabbi Yeshua normally says by karbanos that they are seen as separate, that one is baked and one is fried, they're seen as separate, when it comes to two halves, they're actually seen as one and the same, and therefore if you had a half baked and a half fried, you would bring a carbon for that case. So it says the Gemara, here's where we get to the question. This is a case, the chalukin lechatos. Rabbi Yeshua says the baked and fried have nothing to do with each other when it comes to the carbon chatas. They're separate, the carbon starfi, and yet, even though they're separate in regards to the carbonos, they're combined to create one measurement. And your whole premise, Rav Zera, was to say that when things are separate as carbonos, then when things have no relationship to one another with carbonos, then they cannot combine. Here we see Rabbi Yeshua in our Mishnah over here, they do combine. So the Gemara says, Amarle, he responds, Ma aresha masnila. You taught Reish Lakish's statement, who said this is Rav Yeshua, on the first part of the Mishnah, and therefore he had a question. Anana Seifa Masnis Nalan. We learned this statement on the second part of the Mishnah, meaning, V'lo Kashlan, we didn't have a question, meaning, the second part of the Mishnah said, Mishnei minim pater tzrich lememar. The second part of the Mishnah said that if you have two minim, you eat a half of one min, of one type, and a half of one type, okay, they don't combine together. And now we're asking a different question. We're saying, isn't that obvious? Of course, if I had a half of one type and a half of another type of prohibition, of course they don't combine. So to that's where Reish Lakish was really coming to answer. Reish Lakish was coming to answer this question. This statement, when it said that it's two minim, two types, the second part of the Mishnah, which said it's two types, they don't combine, we're actually going on a case where it's really one type, but they're made differently. Okay? V'mai kari le shnei minim. Why are they called two types? Shachalo b'shnei tamchuin, because they're prepared as two separate dishes. Rabbi Yeshua, and the author of this Mishnah is Rabbi Yeshua, Damar Tamchuin Mechalkin, who says that they are separate, that two types of dishes are separate when it comes to carbon, v'kamash malan, and here he's teaching us the Rabbi Yeshua ben lekula ben lechum. Rabbi Yeshua really holds this consistently, and now there's no question, because what comes out, the way we're learning it now, is that Rabbi Yeshua holds that when a person has a baked piece of chelev and a baked piece of and a fried piece of chelev, then they don't combine and bring a separate carbon. And then the seif of the Mishnah said if you have two halves from two minim, they don't combine. What are we talking about? We're not talking about blood and chelev. We're talking about chelev that's baked and chelev that's fried. And there we're saying they don't combine. It's Rabbi Yeshua who is consistent in holding that these are really two dishes. And what comes out is that they're separate for their karbanos. They have no relationship in karbanos, and they don't combine, which is exactly what Rav Zera told us. Okay, good. Now the Gemara just tries to clarify the how to read this Mishnah, because if we want to say the seifa of our Mishnah is talking about a case where it's one type, meaning it's chelev, but it's baked in two different ways, then miklal dereisha min echad v'tamchoy echad. That means the first case where it said if you have two halves of the same type, then they do combine. Ask the Gemara, isn't that obvious? If it's two halves of chalev, of course, and they're both baked, they're both fried, of course it's going to be one connected thing, and you're going to be high for it. So Rav Huna, the Gemara says, the Gemara says, no, there is a novelty, because what we're saying over here is you ate half a piece of chalev, and then you became cognizant of the fact that you ate chalev. Now, normally, when you become cognizant of the fact that you did something wrong, then you trigger the obligation to bring a carbon at that moment. But over here, you only ate half a portion, and then I became knowledgeable of it. So is that knowledge enough to now separate the half portion that I ate from the next half portion that I ate? Rabbi Gamliel says no. Since your knowledge of the half portion that you ate would not trigger a carbon, therefore that knowledge is ignored entirely, and therefore the two halves, even though there was knowledge in between, do combine. And basically what we're saying now is there is some novelty in this teaching. Okay, that light in the background is really bothering me, so I'm going to just move this a little bit here. Here we go. Okay, let's go a little bit further. Now we're going into Ayin Aleph Amud Beis by the two dots. Let's go. Itmar, it was taught. Let's say a person. So let's just review a couple of important principles. One. If a person eats two pieces of chalev, now it's going to be bothering you if you're watching this. Okay, can't get my head in the way of this. Okay, if a person goes ahead and eats two pieces of chalev, any two prohibitions within one lapse of knowledge, then you bring one carbon, right? That's the halakha we've seen until now. Now, when it comes to sinning, there's a couple of different steps. I give up. Okay, there's a couple of different steps. There is the sin. I made a mistake, okay? Then there is, I realize I made a mistake. Then there is, I separate an animal to bring as a carbon, and then I bring as a carbon, okay? Those are a bunch of different steps that take place along the way, okay? So we're going to see a scenario where a person does two prohibitions, mistakes, okay? And then remembers not both of them, but only one of them, okay? How does that impact things? Let's see. Itmar. Let's say a person eats two portions of chalev in one lapse of awareness. And then he realizes, oh, whoops, I ate chalev. But he doesn't realize the second piece of meat that he ate was chalev, only the first piece. And then he goes ahead and realizes the second one was also chalev, okay? So he has a knowledge by the first one, and then a knowledge on the second one. Rav Yochanan says, in this case, I'm going to be obligated to bring two karbanos, right? As soon as I remember about the first one, I have to bring a carbon for that, and then and that first carbon doesn't cover the second thing because I wasn't aware of the second sin, and only later when I find out about the fact that I ate a second piece of chalev, then I'll bring another carbon. Reish Lakish says, no, I'm only going to be obligated to bring one carbon, even though I knew about it, right? I knew about it. I did not know about the second one when I knew about the first one. But since I'm obligated to bring a carbon and they both took place in the same lapse, I only bring one carbon for both of them. And now the Gemara is going to show the sources for these views. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayav. And remember these psukim because we're going to come back to this a little bit later on in the Gemara. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayav. Rabbi Yochanan says that you are liable to two karbanos. Why? Chataso vehevi. The pasuk says, in the context of a carbon chat, says, for your sin you bring, implying that there is a sin where you may have thought that you don't bring a second carbon, but it says no, for each one of your sins you do bring a carbon. It's referring to this case. Reish Lakish Amar Pater mechataso v'nislach lo. Reish Lakish says you're exempt because there's a pasuk which says that you only bring, that there's going to be a case where you bring a carbon chatas mechataso from your sin, meaning you're bringing a carbon, or there is some triggering for bringing a carbon, or in a partial sin and not in the whole sin. And nonetheless, you're going to be, that one carbon is going to cover both cases. Ask the Gemara, Reish Lakish, what does Reish Lakish do with that other pasuk that Rav Yochanan that the pasuk clearly says there's a case where you're going to bring two karbanos? Hahula achar kapara. There, Reish Lakish says there is a case where this similar scenario where you are going to bring two karbanos. What's that? It's a case where I did not realize that these pieces were chalev, and I go and eat one, and then I go eat a second one, and then I realize the first one was chalev, and I bring a carbon for the first one, and then I say, oh, the second piece was also chalev. In that case, the carbon that I brought for the first one does not work for the second piece, okay? So ahula achar kapara, it's already after the person made affected atonement, okay? Rav Yochanan nami hachsim echadaso v'nislach lo. According to Rav Yochanan, there's that pasuk which implies that there's a scenario where I bring a carbon chatas even though I'm not really bringing a carbon for the entire sin. What's that referring to? So hachamai skinon, he says it's a very strange case. Person eats 1.5 pieces of chalev, meaning one portion and a half portion of chalev. V'nodelo al kezayis, and he realizes the first kezayis of the 1.5 that he ate was chalev. He doesn't realize the second half was. Okay. V'chazra achal kchatzi zayis acher, and then he goes ahead and he eats a second half, another half, a portion of chalev. Okay. Ve'alema shel sheni. Okay. During the same lapse of awareness as the second of the half of the first piece, okay? Ma'ad Taimlin Starfu. You should combine the two. The Gemara says, Kamash Malan, Rav Yochanan says no. Once I'm obligated, or once I brought a korban for the first one, even though I didn't know the half was there, but I brought a korban, I brought atonement for the first one that was attached to that half, that one korban already covers the other half, and therefore that's a case where I'm only bringing a korban for partial, and it forgives my entire sin, okay? Now, we want to clarify the opinions of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. Amrlei, Ravina, Rashi, Dis Yadalei Kodem Hafrasha Pligi. When Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, what's happening over here, what they're arguing about is there is some level of, there is some division, some break between sin number 1 and sin number 2, which prevents the single korban for atoning for their sins. So Ravina asks Rav Ashi, Dis Yadalei Kodem Hafrasha Pligi. Do they disagree about a case where this is all happening before you separate the korban, before you, meaning separate the animal to be brought? This is the argument. Demar Savar Yedias Mechalkos. Rav Yochanan holds that as soon as the person is aware that they made a sin, that in and of itself creates the wall, right? In other words, again, what's the case? I ate 2 pieces of fat, and then I remember after the first piece of fat, that already creates a wall, and I can no longer bring my that one korban does not connect the second sin. Umar Savar Frashas Mechalkos. And the other, so Mar Savar Yedias Mechalkos, Rav Yochanan holds that as soon as I'm aware, that creates a separation. Umar Savar Frashas Mechalkos. Rish Lakish says no. The fact that I'm aware, that's not enough to invalidate that one korban. The fact that I'm aware of it does not now separate one from the second. But if I go ahead and I separate a korban, separate an animal for the first sin, then that's going to be after I already separate. Module Rish Lakish Rav Yochanan. Rish Lakish would agree to Rav Yochanan to Chayiv Shteim. Once I already separated the offering, once I already separated the animal, and then I remember afterwards, I made another sin. Then that animal that I already separated, it can't go back to that second sin. Okay, is that the case? To Chayiv Shteim. Odilma, perhaps not like that. Perhaps this Yada Leila Achar Frasha Pligi. Maybe they argue specifically after an animal was separated, was designated. Uvahapli, this is the argument. Tamar Savar Frashas Mechalkos. Rav Yochanan holds that designating or separating the animal as an offering, that's what creates the division between number 1 and number 2. Umar Savar Kaparas Mechalkos. Rish Lakish says no, up until, even if you separate it as a korban, you separate the animal to be brought as a korban, that's not enough to separate 1 and 2. But when I bring it as an offering, if I went ahead, again, that's the case. I remember I ate 2 pieces of fat, and I bring a korban for the first sin, and then afterwards, after bringing the korban, I realize, I also ate a second piece of chalev. In that case, Reish Lakish would say, too bad. Okay, but before you do any separating, module Rav Yochanan Reish Lakish, Rav Yochanan agreed to Reish Lakish, Deino chayv ala achas. Maybe Rav Yochanan agrees, if I just had knowledge, that would be enough. If I just had knowledge, that would not be enough to separate 1 and 2. So we're not sure which exact case. We know that they're arguing about separation. The question is the separation with knowledge? Is the separation with when you actually designate something for a korban, or is the separation between 1 and 2 when I actually bring it as a korban? Odilma, or alternatively, bein bezu bachlokas. Maybe they argue about all those cases. Okay, Amrlei. So Ravina tries to answer the question. It says mistabra bein bezu machlokas. It's reasonable to say that they argue in all those cases. Okay, because if you want to say that they only argue before it was separated, but after designation, Modle Reish Lakish Rav Yochanan Chayiv Shteim. Rav Yochanan and Rav Lakish would agree, meaning Rav Lakish would agree to Rav Yochanan that after I already separated, there he'd agree to bring 2 karbanos. If that's the case, remember there was a pasuk that we asked on Reish Lakish. We said, isn't there a verse that Rav Yochanan quoted that shows that you are Chayiv too? So why did Reish Lakish have to say, that pasuk that talks about 2 is specifically because you already brought 1 as a karban? Why did he have to say that? Look, la'achar frasha. He could have said much easier. He could have said it's only after designation, because right now we're entertaining the possibility that Reish Lakish would agree after designation. But the fact that he doesn't say that verse, the pasuk which says they are chayav for 2 karbanos is talking about achar hafrasha, after separating, shows that he holds after hafrasha. He would still say that's not enough. He would still say that there's no wall and 1 karban would be enough. And if you want to say that they only argue after separation about kodem hafrasha, but before designating, before separating it with just the idea alone, Rav Yochanan would agree. If I just had knowledge of the fact that I made that first sin, that would be enough. That would not be enough of a wall, and I would still bring 1 korban for both. The fact that the pasuk, again, we had a question on Rav Yochanan. We said, Rav Yochanan, what do you do with the pasuk of Reish Lakish? What do you do with that verse which says they only chayav 1 korban for a partial thing? Why did he say that he gave that whole complicated case of the one kazayas and a half a kazayas, and that's the case? Why don't you say, look, me kodem afrasha? You could say, yeah, I agree, there's a case where we only chayv one karban, in a scenario where I just had knowledge of the fact that I sinned for the first one, and it's before I actually designated one. The fact that we did not do so implies that they disagree through and through. They disagree both in the case where I had yediyah, just knowledge, and they disagree in the case where there was hafrasha, where it was separated. In both those cases, Rav Yochanan says 2. In both those cases, Rish Lakish says 1. The Gemara rejects this as a proof. The Gemara says, "V'dilma sapuke mesapkele." Maybe the individual who was speaking on behalf of Rish Lakish and Rav Yochanan and presenting their views, maybe he was not sure. And what he was saying was he was hedging his bets. V'imtim to lomar ka'amar. He was saying, like, if you want to say, what that means is as follows. Imtim to lomar kodem hafrasha pligiba. If you want, so really, I think that one possibility is that they don't argue before hafrasha. But if you want to say they do disagree before it was separating, then Rabbi Yochanan in that case, how does Rabbi Yochanan explain the pasuk? Because he'll use that strange case of 1.5 pieces of chelav. And the flip side, really, there's a possibility that they agree after designation, after it's separated. But if you want to say that they also argue in that case, how does Rish Lakish learn the verse? Then he'd have to say it's in the case of after atonement itself. Okay, so bottom line is, the way we're coming out is there is a debate between Rish Lakish and Rav Yochanan about this scenario where a person did 2 sins in one state of forgetfulness, and they become aware of the first sin and not aware of the second immediately. And we're unsure, and so Rav Yochanan says you're going to be obligated in 2 karbanos. Rish Lakish says you're only obligated in 1 karban, and we're not sure exactly where they're arguing about. Are they arguing about in the case where there was knowledge about the first sin? Okay, or are they arguing in the case where they already separated 1 karban for the first sin? We're not sure which one of those 2. Maybe they're arguing in both those cases. The Gemara leaves that unresolved. We are going to pick up tomorrow with a new Gemara on the bottom of Ayin Aleph Amud Beis. These are tough Gemaras. This is really probably the toughest parak in Masechah Shabbos. So just hold on tight. We will get through it, and I look forward to picking up tomorrow. Have a great day. Good Vach Shvat Tov.